The Everlasting Lollipop by Paul Averitt. Johnny found a magic nickel, so naturally he went straight to Mr. Denny's candy store. "I'll take that big red lollipop in the corner," he said. "It ought to last longer than the others." "It is a very long-lasting lollipop," said Mr. Denny. "Why, if you don't lick too much at one time, it will last practically forever." It was indeed a very special lollipop. The first day, Johnny was careful to lick it very gently on the underneath side only, and at bedtime it was as big as ever. The next morning, Johnny took the lollipop to school in his hip pocket with the stick sticking up so he could reach it easily. During the day, the lollipop seemed to get heavier and heavier, and Johnny felt obliged to lick it all through recess to lighten the weight. Then, just to make sure, he licked it all through lunch and all afternoon. He wrapped the lollipop in a newspaper and took it home in his book satchel. The next morning was Saturday. He thought about the lollipop after breakfast and hurried to take another lick. Sure enough, the lollipop had grown during the night, and it was now as big as a dinner plate. Johnny took the lollipop out to play. It was hard to swing or slide with the big lollipop in one hand, so most of the time he just stood around licking away. He licked away all morning and all afternoon. He gave Mary and Sammy and all the kids on the block free licks, but the lollipop grew bigger all the time. During the next week, Johnny spent all of his spare time licking the magic lollipop. Each day he grew a little fatter, and the lollipop grew larger. Soon the lollipop was so big that Johnny had to carry it over his shoulder like a gun. When he walked down the street, all the kids on the block followed along behind. "Give us a lick, Johnny," they shouted. "Ah, come on, give us another lick." Johnny was glad to share the big lollipop. Sometimes he stood it on the ground while all of the children gathered around and licked away together, but it bothered him to have them follow him everywhere. Sometimes he tried to run away, but the lollipop was getting too heavy, and Johnny was getting too fat to run very far. So Johnny took the lollipop home and stood it in the umbrella stand. His mother found it almost at once. "Johnny Johnson," she said sternly, "that sticky lollipop is rubbing against my nice umbrellas. You must take it out to the tool shed and put it beside the rakes and hoes." A few days later, the lollipop had grown taller than the rakes and hoes. It was actually pushing against the roof of the tool shed. "That pesky lollipop is growing like a Jimson weed," said Johnny's father when he saw it. "Why, it's about to poke through the roof of my tool shed." He dragged it into the backyard. "Johnny," he said, "we'll have to stand your lollipop out here. Run and get the shovel." Then Johnny's father dug a hole in the backyard and planted the lollipop stick in the ground like a tree. Johnny hadn't had a good lick for several days. He started at once to climb the lollipop stick, but he had grown too fat. Poor Johnny. He was too fat to reach his own lollipop to lick it. One day, Mr. Denny from the candy store came walking by. When he reached Johnny's house, Mr. Denny was so amazed that his mouth fell open and his hat jumped off. My goodness, he exclaimed. He walked over and felt the lollipop stick. Then he leaned back and looked up at the shining red candy on top. "Remarkable," he muttered. He stood and looked at Johnny for a minute. "I'll tell you what I'll do, he said finally. "You give me this lollipop, which certainly isn't doing any good here, and I'll give you one regular size, guaranteed not to last more than one day lollipop every Saturday morning." "That is a very good offer," replied Johnny, acting just as businesslike as Mr. Denny. "I accept, beginning next Saturday." The next day, two men drove up to Johnny's house with a big crane. They backed the crane into the yard, picked up the lollipop, and drove away. Johnny ran along behind as they moved slowly down the street, with the lollipop stick dragging along behind. The crane went straight to Mr. Denny's store. There, the men got down and dug a hole in front of the door. Then they moved the crane over and carefully set the lollipop in the hole, just as it had been in Johnny's backyard. Next, two painters came with long ladders and painted the word Denny's on both sides of the lollipop. Then Mr. Denny rubbed his hands together joyfully. "That's a very fine sign, men," he said. Then he turned to Johnny. "Come in, young man, and get your lollipop for the week." Johnny took another red one. "It's nice to know that I will be seeing you every week, Mr. Denny," he said. "It's almost as good as having an everlasting lollipop, isn't it? Thank you very much." And that's the end.